So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled 20th Century Fiction, where we're looking at Catherine Mansfield's short story, The Fly. So we've already had some lectures on this, so we'll just continue from where we left off last time. So we're seeing how this story is obviously very modernist in terms of looking at memory, in terms of looking at trauma and streams of consciousness, but also and equally this is a story about masculinity and masculinity crisis post-First World War, something which we've seen already in Mrs. Dalloway, and also to a lesser extent in Eliot's early poetry. Now, what is very obvious in the story is how there's an allegorical quality about the characterization. So the boss and the boss's son are very allegorically representative of certain kinds of masculinity, the boss being that of robust, domineering, hegemonic masculinity, socially prestigious, earning lots of money, healthy, robust, etc. Whereas the son is someone who's supposed to step into that same shoe. And we see how the First World War, which can also be seen as a masculinist event or a masculinist expansionist event of greed and territorialization, ironically, the First World War actually interrupts this masculinity narrative in the sense of killing the son. So the boss's son has been killed in the war, and we see how that interrupts the entire narrative in the story. And contrasted with the boss, we have someone like Mr. Woodfield, who is obviously very senile, very fragile, and who represents a very an almost disembodied kind of masculinity, enervated, exhausted, etc. And the exhaustion and enervation are quite obvious in Woodfield's characterization. And we see how he seemed to have moved on from the point of trauma. I mean, he too had lost his son in the war. His son is called Reggie, and we see how his wife Gertrude and his daughters had been to Belgium to take a look at his son's grave, and he wasn't there in the sense in Belgium. So he's represented the whole story of visiting the son's grave in a second-hand information way to the boss. And we saw how the entire metaphor, the entire rhetoric, the entire vocabulary in terms of how Woodfield describes his son's grave is very touristy kind of vocabulary, very touristy kind of rhetoric. It's not really the rhetoric of a bereaving father or a mourning father. And instead, it's the rhetoric of a visitor, a tourist. He goes and looks at, the gaze is very touristy, and the gaze is important over here because he goes and he describes, he hasn't been there, but he describes how the paths are nice and broad, how the graveyards are beautiful, looked after. Then he talks about the price of jam in the hotels, etc., and how the entire hotel industry is blossoming around this trauma tourism, as it were. But what obviously gets or doesn't get highlighted, or rather what's a conspicuous absence in Woodfield's description is any real sentiment for his son's loss. And conspicuous absence is a very important thing in Mansfield's fiction, because it's a very, as you can see from the story, it's a very economic kind of expression. There's an economy of expression. It's very minimalist, very sparse in terms of how it is represented, and there's a lot of things packed into it. So conspicuous absence becomes a very important point. So for instance, there's no mention at all about the boss's wife or the son's daughter, the son's mother, who would happen to be the boss's wife. So the mother is conspicuously absent in the story. There's no mother figure at all. It's entirely about the boss and his heir, the son, and how his heir left now because the son has been killed in the war. So this very masculinist kind of universe is something which is obviously parodied and critiqued by Mansfield. This is a very scathing feminist critique on the First World War. And the only woman we get to know are Woodfield's wife and daughter. So we see how post-First World War, they seem to have more agency over Woodfield. I mean, they seem to decide when he's released to the city, they seem to decide to dress him up, to brush him, and release him to the city just so he can go and visit his old friends. And also they're the ones who travel to Belgium to take a look at his son's grave, and not Woodfield. Woodfield is just reporting what he heard from the woman back to the boss. We see how at the beginning of the story how the boss had very almost violently decided or tried or orchestrate or engineer this entire architecture of newness around them, right? Everything is new, the carpets are new, the heatings are new, the bookcases are new, etc. But amidst all this newness, there's a spectral photograph of the boy, something which is quite old and almost 6 years old. And obviously we know now that the photograph of the boy is exactly what holds the key to the boss's trauma. Now, before I move on to the next section where Woodfield has left the room and was, had been patronizing to him in the beginning, poured him whiskey, had said a very sexist comment on women's lack of understanding, so that all that hegemonic masculinity bits were all covered and marked and embodied. Now, the moment the grave of the boss's son was mentioned, the moment the grave of the Woodfield's son was mentioned, that is the moment when the boss's masculinity is sort of shaken up a little bit, because we see now that he doesn't really have a male heir to carry on his kingdom per se, right? So this heirlessness is something which is becoming obviously part of the loss, the sense of existential loss the boss suffers now. Now, what this story does, and I have an article which I'm happy to upload in the course of this this particular NPTEL course, 20th Century Fiction. I have an article, published article on this particular story that I'm happy to share in the platform that we have. But in that article and also elsewhere and also here, I would like to make the argument that there's a very perverse equation over here between masculinity and trauma, or traumatophilia, or hysteria to some extent. Now, hysteria, as some of you would know, had traditionally been medicalized as a female malady, something which happens only to women because it's part of the woman's body, and the male body can never be hysteric. Now, obviously, that all changed with the First World War, because post First World War we had something called the shell shock, which is something which anticipated what we now call PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, where we have this very muscular, strong, manly men coming back from the trenches, shivering like children, shivering like quote-unquote women. So suddenly it was very spectacularly evident that men could also be nervous, men could also be hysteric. Obviously, hysteria had been always historically medicalized as a female disease, as a female malady, so a new name had to be given to this male condition, and the new name for a point of time was shell shock, and then later on, of course, it became more classified medically in military medicine as PTSD. Now, interestingly, in this particular story, what we get to see in a moment, we'll see how the boss basically congratulates himself on his masculinity by retaining in his mind the original moment of trauma, the original experience of trauma. In other words, he always wants to feel exactly the same way as he felt 6 years ago when the first news of his son's death came to him, right? So that was a big moment for him, and his loss in his mind is bigger than anyone else's loss, right? And that sense of superiority, that sense of entitlement to one's trauma is a very perverse thing, but it's exactly what happens over here. So he has a sense of entitlement to his trauma, and at one point he will say, he will think, and it will be told to us, that other men might live the lost on, other men might move on, other men might just make peace with it, but he, the boss, can never do it because his son is dead, and that's a very, very special kind of tragedy. So we can see how the equation between trauma and masculinity gets established in the story in a very, very complex psychological manner. Okay, so we see this point where the Woodfield is about to leave the boss's office, and is the boss seeing him out. He came round this desk, and this should be on the screen. He came round by his desk, following the shuffling footsteps to the door, and saw the old fellow out. Woodfield was gone. For a long moment, the boss stayed, staring at nothing. So again, we can say this is probably staring at nothingness, which is staring back at him, right? Staring at nothing. While the grey-haired office messenger, watching him, dodged in and out of his cubbyhole like a dog that expects to be taken for a run. So again, look at the animal metaphors used over here, the infantilized metaphors, the animal metaphors, all being used very, very interestingly, right? So, and then he says, "I'll see nobody for half an hour, Macy," said the boss. Nobody at all. So we see how even the office messenger has a name, Macy, but the boss and the son don't have a name at all. So again, this is part of the allegorical quality about this categorization over here. Very good, sir. So Macy's obviously, his job is to say yes to whatever the boss says. The door is shut. The firm, heavy steps recrossed the bright carpet. The fat body plumped down in the spring chair, and leaning forward, the boss covered his face with his hands. He wanted, he intended, he had arranged to weep. So the last bit is interesting over here. We can see how the boss is making this entire ritual about weeping. He's going back to his office, his fat body is plumped down in a spring chair, and he's covering his face with his hands. And we told that he wanted, he intended, he had arranged to weep. So the entire idea of weeping, the entire idea of hysteria, of mourning, becomes the masculinist activity over here, which is a subversion in some sense of the stereotypical understanding of mourning and hysteria. But the interesting thing is the boss here wants to appropriate the sentiment of mourning, and add that to his masculinity, and he wants to appropriate a sentiment of hysteria and add that to his masculinity, right? So the whole idea of equating masculinity and trauma becomes interesting, and we see over here how we're told that he wanted, he intended, he had arranged to weep. So weeping obviously becomes a ritual, a part of the ritual, a fallout of the ritual. So he had intended, he had arranged to weep, and he better start weeping now. So that becomes part of the masculine, it's almost muscular control or motor control over his own senses. So he seems to have, he wants to have entire ownership or absolute ownership of his motor mechanisms, including weeping. It had been a terrible shock. We get this backstory now a little bit. It had been a terrible shock to him when old Woodyfield sprang the remark upon the boy's grave. It was exactly as though the earth had opened and he had seen the boy lying there with Woodyfield's girls staring down at him. So again, this becomes almost like a Medusa stare, where the woman look at the man and turn them into stones. He's literally a stone. It's literally a tombstone now, and in some of his dreams or nightmares or visions, the boss thinks that his grave, the sun is opening up and the sun is inside the grave, lying unblemished forever. So there's no degeneration, whatever. But Woodyfield's daughters and wife are staring at him. And it's very freezing, Medusa kind of a stare that a woman gives to the man over here. And that, in a sense, is an experience of emasculation for the boss as well as for the son, who is dead now. Right, so the son is immobile, almost stuck in a coffin. It doesn't know what to go, doesn't know what to do, and the woman is staring at him as if, you know, they're turning him into a stone further. Right, so it was strange. Although over 6 years had passed away, the boss never thought of the boy except as lying unchanged. So in the boss's mind, the boy had always remained unchanged. 6 years ago, whatever he looked like, whatever he seemed like, is exactly the way he had stayed in the boss's imagination. Okay, unblemished in his uniform, asleep forever. My son, groaned the boss, but no tears came yet. In the past, in the first months and even years after the boy's death, he had only to say those words to be overcome by such a grief that nothing short of a violent fit of weeping could relieve him. So this is the point in the story where we begin to get a sense of the boss's hubris. You know what a hubris is? Hubris is false pride. It's something which you borrow from the Greek tragedies, something which is almost all tragic heroes. They're otherwise impeccable, they're otherwise perfect, they're otherwise very, very good and caring, except the fact that they have hubris, to think too highly of themselves. The vanity overshoots, eclipses the good work that they do. So, and the boss over here obviously will exhibit hubris. He would tell himself that his son was the only son, so everyone else might be moving on, but he doesn't want to move on. He cannot move on because, his son is his only son. So, we see how he also taught himself in his mind that he can control his emotions, he can control his crying at will. Right, so I can cry anytime I want to. I can emote anytime I want to, as far as my son's death is concerned, and remembering that is concerned. Okay, and this is a hubristic statement that he had made earlier to people. Time, he had declared then, he had told everybody, could make no difference. Other men might perhaps recover, might live the loss down, but not he. So again, this is a classic hubris statement where he says, I defy time. I challenge time to dry up my weep, and this is exactly what's happened in the story. This becomes almost a revenge of time in some sense. But the boss at this point at least wants to enact some kind of a revenge on time, where he tells time openly that other men might live down, but no matter how much time goes away, I'm going to be stuck to this mourning figure forever, right? So I'll be the perfect mourner. So time could make no difference. Other men perhaps might recover, might live the loss down, but not he. So again, this hubristic understanding of himself becomes interesting over here. Other men might live the loss, other men may move on, but not he, not me. I lost my only son, except as if he was the only father with an only son in the entire Europe, in the entire world, fighting the First World War. Okay, other men might live the loss down, might recover, might live the loss down, but not he. How was it possible? His boy was an only son. So it's almost as if no one else had an only son who got killed in the war. But again, look at the very myopic, parochial, and also quite entitled view of the boss, only son. Ever since his birth, the boss had worked as building up his business for him. It had no other meaning if it was not for the boy. Life itself had come no other meaning. How on earth could he have slaved, denied himself, kept going all these years without a promise forever before him, of the boy stepping into the shoes and carrying on where he left off? So again, look at the conspicuous absence of the woman figure over here, the conspicuous absence of the boss's wife or the son's mother over here. So everything is projected to the boss, everything is focalized to the boss. Obviously that is critiqued by Mansfield in a very, very subtle and scathing manner. But what he's saying, what the boss is thinking over here is, the entire life of the boss had been to prepare something which the person like him, same genes, same blood, same body, will step in and carry on, and hopefully at some point his son will also emerge and he will give him this kingdom. So it becomes constant and endless chain process, and the endlessness is exactly what's interrupted by the death of the son, and that's something which we'll come back to later. Okay, so he was a very promising son who's beginning to flower as an employee, as a boss, as someone who's devastating and ruthless and cunning in business, which is exactly what the boss is. But then all that has come to an end because of one incident. And again, look at the way how this incident has been narrated to us. And that promise had been so near been fulfilled. The boy had come in office learning the ropes for a year before the war. So the boy used to come to the office learning about the trade, getting accustomed to the trade for almost 1 year before joining office. Every morning they had started off together. They had come back by the same train. So the boss and the son, they would go out together. The boss would go to his cabin, the son would go to do the site perhaps, and then he would do some very, very menial jobs, which is going to please the boss quite well. Right. So we told that every time they used to go out together, come back together, and this entire narrative of intimacy between the boss and the son is interesting because again the other parent is absent, the spouse is absent, the mother figure, the wife figure is entirely absent. We don't even know if she's alive or dead. Is that sense of absence which is there, which is articulated over here. And what congratulations he had received as a boy's father. No wonder he had taken to it marvelously. As to his popularity with the staff, every man jack of them, down to old Macy, couldn't make enough of the boy, and he wasn't in the least spoilt. No, he was just say his bright natural self, with the right words for everybody, with that boyish look and the habit of saying simply splendid. Now this bit is interesting. If you want to take a look at and those of you interested in research in masculinity, this is definitely a very key point. If you take a look at the rhetoric used in this particular point, simply splendid and not least be spoiled, very industrious, and very, very enterprising. Now, this is exactly the brand of masculinity created by the Boy Scout movements in Europe and America and other parts of England, especially in England. And this brand of Boy Scout masculinity is exactly what informed the empire and the entire imperial expansion. Now, the boy over here is obviously part of the imperial expansionist program because the boy is someone, we don't quite know what the boss's business is, but obviously he seems to be quite ruthless in terms of his business enterprise. So it could be something which is morally dubious, we don't quite know. But the whole point is the son was prepared, was being groomed, was being trained to take over the kingdom from where the boss had left, right? And he seems to be this very boyish, enterprising, industrious kind of a person who everyone likes. So he's got this boyish look, and he had this habit of saying simply splendid. So everything was simply splendid to him. It made it alliterate. And again, that becomes very, very boyish, Boy Scoutish kind of a movement, Boy Scoutish kind of a rhetoric used by the boy over here. So we see how the entire construct of masculinity is at play over. The boy is someone who's supposed to take over from the boss, and how this entire takeover is supposed to take place in a very seamless way. And the seamlessness is interrupted exactly by the First World War, and this is what we are told. But all that was over and done with as though it never had been. So in one flash, for instance, everything came to an end. And how so? The day had come when Macy had handed him the telegram that brought the whole place crushing about his head. Deeply regret to inform you that I had left the office a broken man with his life in ruins. So this is a very standard telegram sent out to all the parents who lost their sons in the war. So if you see movies of First World War, we find that there's a long template which is being typed up by the typewriter. We regret to inform you, and there's a blank space in which the name is filled in, other biographical details are filled in. But the template is very standardized, and that actually makes it very, very cool. The fact that the institution of military is letting you know that you've lost a dear one in the war, and then the entire impersonal touch makes it even more menacing. So the rhetorical way is quite impersonal in quality, and that had obviously fueled the boss's trauma. Okay. So deeply regret to inform you, and he had left the office a broken man, his life in ruins. So again, if we take this point and go back to the beginning of the story, we find how the boss is trying to reconstruct himself. So he had been broken by the First World War, by the death of his son, and now is making an effort to reconstruct himself by getting more material markers and electric heating, and different kinds of things, right? 6 years ago, 6 years, how quickly time passed. It might have happened yesterday. The boss took his hands from his face. He was puzzled. Something seemed to be wrong with him. He wasn't feeling as he wanted to feel. He decided to get up and have a look at the boy's photograph. It wasn't a favorite photograph of his. The expression was unnatural. It was cold, even stern looking. The boy had never looked like that. So again, this is a moment of epiphany for the boss's son. And the boss is obviously looking at the boss's son through a very focalized frame over here. And a focalized frame is a photograph. Interestingly, this is a photograph which is supposed to project a certain sentiment to the boss. He wants to cry, he wants to weep out his sorrow, he wants to weep out his mourning, and is looking at a photograph to get a trigger from which he is going to weep. But then he realizes this is not a good photograph for the son, so he needs a different photograph. So it almost becomes something erotic in quality. I'm looking at a photograph to have an erotic experience. So this release that the boss talks about over here is obviously there's a quasi-erotic quality about this release, because that also reestablishes his masculinity, because he thinks he's in complete control over everything around him, and the sense of control gives him a sense of entitlement, so he needs to know everything, he needs to have this entire knowledge of everything. So that brand of masculinity, which is all controlling, all knowing, all traveling, that's come to an end over here after the First World War. And instead we have Woodyfield is locked up in his house, so the all traveling bit is completely gone. The son, the daughter, and the wife, they all take over in terms of running the household, and they only grant him permission to come to the city every day, except every day, every Tuesday, every week, right? So that becomes his only relief that he can look forward to, right? So the question of agency becomes important in this sense, because agency stereotypically has always been a manly enterprise, but post First World War we find how agency becomes more sort of inverted in quality. It's the wife and the daughters who travel to Belgium. It's they who report back about the jam. It's they who haggle with the jam prices, in the hotel rooms. And like I said, it's they who give a report to the trauma in terms of how the sites are kept now in terms of the buried soldiers, right? So that degree of mobility and agency is now conferred or now visible with the women rather than the men. The men obviously are senile and they're waiting to die. They're two bereaving fathers, and they obviously they've got nothing to look forward to. The only thing they had to look forward to is the sons, the creation of the sons in terms of being heirs to the kingdom. But that possibility is now permanently gone. It's precluded. Okay, so he's trying to take a look at the boy's photograph and relieve himself by crying, right? He's got his clothes off and he's looking at the photo and tries to relieve himself to a very bodily, functional way. But we are told that the boss is unable to carry out. It's almost a performance anxiety about weeping. So again, if you take a look at weeping, mourning, hysteric weeping or hysteric mourning, these are stereotypically speaking very, very feminine activities, quote unquote feminine, whatever that means. But the boss is trying to appropriate those activities in terms of re-establishing his masculinity. So that therein lies a complication in this story. Right, so he's trying to look at the favorite photograph of the boy that would help him to weep, that would help him to gush out his pent-up emotions, but he cannot find anything at all. Okay. And then, obviously, we're told that the expression was unnatural. It was cool, even stern-looking, right? So it's not really warm the way the boss wanted it. At that moment, the boss noticed that a fly had fallen into the broad inkpot. So this is the point of the story where the fly episode takes place. It's obviously quite symbolic in quality as well, right? So you see the fly fall into his black inkpot and was trying feebly but desperately to clamber out again. Help, help, said his struggling legs. So again, look at the way in which the entire insect is now magnified, right? So we can see the leg, we can see the front leg, we can see the back leg, we can see the two wings, everything can be seen in a very magnified way, right? So that becomes an interesting way of representation. At that moment, the boss noticed a fly had fallen into his broad inkpot. It was trying feebly but desperately to clamber out again. Help, help, said his struggling legs. But the sides of the inkpot were wet and slippery. It fell back again and began to swim. So it's becoming a bit of a Sisyphean enterprise, right? So it's like a birth of Sisyphus, where he you push a clock on top of push a stone on top of a wall, and then the stone rolls on again. You have to go to do it again, and you're doomed to do it forever, right? So there's a Sisyphean quality about the fly over here. He's got a blot of ink falling on him. He's obviously very injured, but he wants to get another chance. He wants to leave this place as soon as possible. So he has it. The fly obviously is exhibiting the kind of masculinity that the boss wanted his son to exhibit, and the boss wanted himself to exhibit, right? So, you know. So it fell back again and began to swim. The boss took up a pen, picked the fly out of the ink, and shook it on a piece of blotting paper. So he takes out the fly and puts it in a blotting paper. For a fraction of a second, it lay still on the dark patch that oozed around it. Then the front legs waved, took over, and pulling its small sodden body up, it began the immense task of cleaning the ink from his wings. So what happens is the boss rescues the fly, fair enough, but he also drops a blot of ink on her. So now obviously she's very, very concerned. The fly becomes concerned, and the fly tries to restart the entire process. So again, this whole idea of restarting and returning to the point of action gives it a Sisyphean quality. It's like the fly is doomed forever to keep restarting. Okay. So for a fraction of a second, it lay still on the dark patch that oozed around it. Then the front legs waved, took hold, and pulling a small sodden body up, it began the immense task of cleaning the tank, the ink from his wings. So again, it's trying to clear the wings from his ink because it can't fly with such heavy ink on it. Okay, over and under, went a leg along the wing, as the stone goes under the kite, over and under the kite. So the stone's kite metaphor is interesting because kite has traditionally been seen as a vehicle of death, right? So if you find old medieval tragedies, you find a scribe, they always come in with this sense of death, and this whole idea of having this kite metaphor. The kite metaphor is something which carries a degree of mortality to it in a very symbolic way. Right, so we know already, if we read this metaphor close enough, we know already the fly is doomed into performing something that would lead to its ultimate demise. Now, there was a pause where the fly, seeming to stand on the tip of its toes, tried to expand first one wing and then the other. It succeeded at last, and sitting down, it began like a minute cat to clean his face. Again, the fly had been careful with his wings, and now he sits in front of the entire magnification takes place over here, and we find that how the fly is equated with a minute cat. And not just that, if you take a look at the description of the fly, the legs, the entire right leg, left leg thing, as if it's a human being, has been shown in very graphic and magnified detail. So the magnification is interesting over here. They're looking at a fly, it was almost big enough to be a minute cat. So you can compare how big the fly is. It's obviously very hyperbolic in quality. No one could imagine that the little front legs rubbed against each other lightly, joyfully. The horrible danger was over. It had escaped. It was ready for life again, right? So, but then Jesse Boss had an idea. He plunged his pen back into the ink, leaned his thick wrist on a blotting paper, and as the fly trod his wings, down came a great heavy blot. So the boss at this point, he wanted to torture the fly, and this becomes interesting because what happens is it becomes an episode of sadomasochism. So the boss is obviously torturing the fly, and the fly is getting tortured, but at the same time the boss is torturing himself because he sees in the struggle of the fly a projection of his own struggle. So he wants the fly to win at one point because that would also mean he would win, right? So there's a very interesting idea of empathy that is created over here, albeit through torture. So the boss is torturing the fly, but in the process he's getting more and more empathetic to the fly in some sense, right? So that's what makes it sadomasochistic. So it's sadist is torturing the fly, as masochistic is also torturing himself, and that loop becomes interesting for us to examine. Okay, so he plunged his pen back to the ink, leaned his thick wrist on the blotting paper, and as the fly trod his wings, down came a great heavy blot. What would make of that? What indeed? The little beggar seemed absolutely coward. So, again, the word beggar is important, as a human being. So you can see how flies are, the fly is increasingly equated with bigger animals. So first, there's a degree of deer and monkey, and then the whole idea of the fly becoming something like cat-like becomes interesting, right? So we see the dog image also before, and all these animal metaphors become interesting because in a very literal and symbolic sense, this is almost like a post-human world, right? The First World War just ended and the demography is very different. We can see in the story there's a very conspicuous absence of women, but also the death of all the young men. The young men are all gone, they're all dead. So Woodfield's son is dead, the boss's son is dead. So the entire demography becomes very disturbed demography, right? So in a sense, all these animal metaphors become important in this short story because, we take a look at the cat image over here, the dog image is used to describe Macy, the boss's messenger. And so the whole idea is to, Mansfield obviously trying to tell us that this is a universe where the able men are all gone. So this is a very differently abled kind of a universe, a very differently abled kind of a cosmos, right? And also the woman over here are very conspicuously absent, so that becomes interesting. Now, the whole idea of using the cat over here is interesting because it's obviously magnifying the creature, and its magnification is it just becomes also an act of deceleration, right? So we see how the entire episode is decelerated in a very, very interesting sense. The deceleration obviously dramatizes what happens. So the boss is dropping blots of ink on the cat, on the fly, which is equated with the cat. But we see how each drop is described in great details and almost slowed down time. And the slowed down time becomes important, just like the magnification of the fly's body becomes important, right? So the fly's body almost gets corporealized. So there's a degree of corporalization of time as well as the fly's body. Okay. And also the whole idea of the little beggar becomes important because a fly is compared to a little beggar, and also this particular description obviously comes from a very patronizing, offensive, masculinist position of privilege, where someone who's underprivileged becomes a little beggar, and the fly over here becomes a little beggar. Again, very Boy Scout, elitist, entitled sense of masculinity, which is being voiced over here through this use of expression. The little beggar seemed absolutely cowed, stunned, and afraid to move because of what would happen next, right? But then, as it painfully it dragged itself forward, the front legs waved, caught hold, and more slowly this time, the task began from the beginning, right? So again, the degree of deceleration is important. It's more slow, and also look at the way in which the front legs have been described. I mean, normally we look at a fly, we don't see the legs. This is one little tiny thing, but it's magnified and the entire process decelerated. So we see how the front legs are waving, catching hold, and slowly beginning to move. So this is what I mean by the Sisyphean quality of the entire episode, where those of you who are aware of the myth of Sisyphus would know that he was doomed to push a stone against a mountain, and it go up all the mountain, and the stone would fall down again, and he was doomed to just carry on this task forever. So Sisyphus obviously represents a sense of purposelessness, and he becomes a very important symbol in existentialist literature, especially in the works of Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus, and Mansfield obviously draws on that Sisyphus image quite heavily over here. Is a plucky little devil, thought the boss, and I felt a real admiration for the fly's courage. Now this is interesting because, again, if you look at the metaphor, he's a plucky little devil, right? So this is very Boy Scout, almost like a head coach goading on the star player. You're a plucky devil, go beat it, you can do it. So it becomes a bit of a pep talk kind of rhetoric over here. Again, very, very masculinist in quality. He's a plucky little devil, to the boss, and I felt a real admiration for the fly's courage. That was the way to tackle things. That was the right spirit, never said die. It was only a question of. So again, this vocabulary is very, very masculinist in quality. That's the way to do it. That's the right spirit, never said die, etc. It's almost like a coach goading on a player to do something. There's a sporting image about it, a sporting quality about this particular vocabulary. It was only a question of. But the fly had once again finished its laborious task, and the boss had just time to refill his pen to shake fair and square on the new clean body. Yet another dark drop. What about it this time? A painful moment of suspense followed, but behold, the front legs were again waving, and the boss felt a rush of relief. So again, this is what I meant when I said that it is sadomasochistic, because on the one hand, the fly is a fly and the boss is a boss, but on the other hand, there's a degree of empathy that the boss creates to the fly, because the fly's struggle, in a way, reminds him of his struggle, and in a way, he wants the fly to win, because the fly's victory would be a very symbolic statement of the boss's own victory. There'll be motivation for the boss to draw on, but obviously, he keeps torturing the fly in the same time. So it becomes a very interesting relationship of torture and empathy, which is simultaneously present. Both these sentiments are simultaneously present. Okay, so the boss drops another blot of ink. What about this time? A painful moment of suspense followed, but behold, the front legs are again waving. The boss felt a rush of relief. So again, this is what I meant when I said he wants the fly to win. He leaned over the fly and said to it tenderly, "You awful little bee," and this bee could be any word. Yeah, which is obviously, offensive in quality, but in a masculinist way, it means something positive, right? So, and again, look at the word tenderly. He's leaning on the fly and telling it tenderly. It's almost like he's caressing the fly, just like we saw that, he wants the fly to win, etc. And then we see this interesting thing, and he actually had a brilliant notion of breathing on it to help the drying process, right? So he's actually trying to breathe on the fly to help it dry itself, while at the same time being the person who dropped the ink in the first place. So we see this very curious commingling of torture and empathy at play over here. So he is both a torturer as well as a tortured, the boss. So he's feeling tortured with the fly, and in the process he's trying to help the fly to come out of it, to get itself dry. All the same, there was something timid and weak about his efforts now, and the boss decided that this time should be the last, and dipped the pen deep into the ink pot. So again, the last blot is about to come now. The boss tries one more time to drop a blot of ink on the fly and see what happens. It was. Now, every time I read this story, I'm reminded of this terrible sense of finality that is there in this one sentence, "it was," which is two words, right? So the sense of finality, the sense of mortality, the sense of ending that is there is so brilliantly captured by this very short sentence, "it was." So, everything comes to an end. It was. The last blot fell on the soaked blotting paper, and the draggle fly lay in it and did not stir. The back legs were stuck to the body, the front legs were not to be seen. So again, it becomes a very mangled body, as you can see. And again, this almost becomes a human body in a sense. And we can always safely say that the fly becomes something of a projection of the boss's son. This is perhaps the way he died. The front legs are mangled and the back legs are not to be seen. The front legs are not to be seen. The back legs are stuck to the body. Again, this is a very typical image of a bombed human soldier, right? A bomb dropping on a trench and a soldier's body getting mangled, the limbs getting mangled and stuck to the body, and some limbs disappearing. So this whole idea of the mangled body becomes a very graphic description over here, a very disturbing description over here. And it's interesting how the description is projected onto the body of the fly. This is what I meant when I said the fly is corporealized in a very, very human way. So the fly becomes humanized and corporealized, and only in the sense of suffering and torture. "Come on," said the boss, "look sharp," and stirred it with a pen in vain. Nothing happened or was likely to happen. The fly was dead. So again, the boss is trying to goad the fly. And again, this is a very complex psychological statement that we can make, that when you say the boss had, he felt a degree of admiration and empathy for the fly's courage to come out of this torture chamber, but at the same time he had constantly tortured him, playing the god as was a victim together. And now when the fly is dead, he's trying to goad it to make it come back to life, just so the fly is coming back to life. The fly is winning will be a motivation for him, but then the fly's death reminds him of his own death, reminds him of his imminent mortality, reminds him of his imminent wait for an ending, and obviously reminds him of his son's death. He stirred it with his pen in vain. Nothing happened or was likely to happen. The fly was dead. Again, a degree of finality and ending about his statement. The boss lifted the corpse on the end of the paper knife and flung it in the waste paper basket. So again, if you look at the movements over here, very, very interesting. The word corpse is used, which is obviously used for human bodies. So the fly is described as a human body. So the fly's body, it's strange that you talk about the fly's body. The fly is a creature, but everything is magnified and decelerated. As I mentioned, the fly's body is now corporealized and it's lifted with a paper knife and flung in the waste paper basket. Again, this is very, very iconic, because in the First World War, this is exactly how the soldiers' dead bodies were flung out of trenches, right, into, it's like a garbage thing. So, there'd be a heap of dead bodies, and this all the dead bodies would be flung from the trenches with a big bayonet sometimes, flung in a big heap of corpses, right, and that big heap became a very, very iconic symbol of human destruction, organic destruction. So again, the sense of trash becomes important, how human bodies become disposable trash. Everything organic becomes disposable trash. We see this almost obsession with trash throughout modernism, and we will move on to this Virginia Woolf short story from here after this called Solid Objects, which is entirely about trash. Right? But even if you take a look at Mrs. Dalloway, A Wasteland, even Eliot's early poetry, or Ulysses for the matter, we find this whole idea of trash becomes important because along with the different machines of production in modernism and modernity, in cultural modernity, we also see different machines of dissemination, and also production entails the production of rubbish, the production of trash, and the human body is now converted into a trash, right? So it flings it to the wastepaper basket, but such a grinding feeling of wretchedness seized him that he felt positively frightened. So again, it's a bit of an oxymoronic expression, positively frightened. So it's being seized and consumed by a certain sentiment, and he's frightened by the sentiment. He started forward and pressed the bell for Macy. "Bring me some fresh blotting paper," he said sternly, "and look sharp about it." So again, he wants desperately to clamber back to his masculinist rhetoric. He was trying desperately to get back and recover and retrieve and re-articulate his masculinist vocabulary. Look sharp about it is how a manly man speaks to his underling. He wants to recover a sense of ownership, a sense of agency. But then it's too late, as we are told. And where the old dog padded away, he fell to wondering what it was he had been thinking about before. What was it? It was, he took out his handkerchief and pressed it inside his collar. For the life of him, he could not remember. So this is how the short story ends. But what happens essentially is this becomes a very sweet revenge of time. And as we mentioned, the boss's hubris was that he had thought that everyone else can live the lost down and move on with time, but he will have triumph over time in the sense of retaining his original experience of trauma. And this is what I mean when I say there is an equation of trauma and privilege in the story. Because the boss thinks that I can re-experience my trauma at will at any given point of time. No passage of time can dilute my trauma in that sense, right? So that's been a hubris all the time. Every time I want to cry at my son's death, I can cry at will, I can weep at will, I can retain and re-articulate and re-experience my trauma very, very experientially and viscerally in a very embodied way. But of course, this fly episode obviously, just completely ends and finishes any sense of struggle for the boss, because the fly struggle comes to an end symbolically and in a very projected kind of a way. His own struggle comes to an end as well, right? So the fly and the boss end together, right? So now he goes back and he's trying to recover his bossness. He's trying to give orders desperately to Macy to bring some fresh blotting paper and to look sharp about it. That's all that he can order for. I mean, also notice the way in which this office, there's no indication of any work getting done, of any productivity at any level. Everything is just coming and being designed as empty structures. The boss comes, there's an office, it's a very decked up office, it's a messenger, etc. But don't quite know what work is done, if any production happens of this office at all, maybe not. So it just becomes an office in a very hollow, emptied out kind of a way. Because obviously the person who would carry on the production, the son, is dead now. So all the boss is doing now is just, stalling the collapse of this entire architecture. And the last statement is important. For the life of him, he could not remember, right? This becomes a very sweet revenge of time when he cannot remember what he was thinking, right? In other words, he becomes quite essentially and symbolically and literally a timeless man, right? He becomes someone who's, denied of time. So timeless in the sense he doesn't have a future, obviously because the son is dead, but also he cannot recover the past because he cannot remember. So obviously his present becomes precarious in that sense. So the precarious quality of his present is because of his timelessness, the fact that he doesn't have a future to look forward to, and also there is no past that he can think of, right? So when I say this is a vendetta of time, what I'm actually saying is time leaves the boss. Right, in that sense, it's timeless. So time goes away from the boss entirely. and he is denied this comfort of time in every which way, and this becomes the vendetta. This becomes the revenge of time, very symbolically and experientially, a revenge against this erstwhile hubris of having control over time, in terms of never living his laws down. Right. So we see how this entire story is deeply, deeply psychological. As you can see, it's very existential, psychological. It's very modernist. With the First World War, it's a very spectral background throughout the story, as you can see, which is something which I saw in A Wasteland as well, and also Mrs. Dalloway more directly. But if you compare and contrast this with Mrs. Dalloway, we find that the minimalism in Mansfield's short fiction actually makes it very, very sinister in quality. So the sinister, cooled quality about loss is conveyed to us in very minimalist ways, and there's hardly any characters, hardly any action, except a fly episode, which is deeply psychological. And we find how streams of consciousness, epiphany, this entire embodied engagement with time, all these become very important markers of masculinity in the story. So in one sense, it's very modernist, it's always engaging with consciousness. In other sense, it's also very, very, it's a deep feminist critique of a certain kind of masculinity, which had historically created the war in the first place, this expansionist kind of masculinity, which the boss embodied. So with that, we come to an end with The Fly. It's a deeply psychological and complex story, so do read it again and again. And like I said, I have an article on it, which was published in a Catherine Mansfield and Psychology collection published by Edinburgh University Press, which I'm happy to upload in the forum for your perusal. So from this, we'll move on to the next text, which I'll announce in due course of time. So do reread The Fly and write to me in the forum if you have any more questions or comments on this text. Thank you for your attention.